Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Life of the Emperor Francis Joseph by Francis Gribble. Chapter 11.
It seemed better to defy chronology and speak of Frau Schratt at once. We do not want her continually flitting across the stage to the interruption of grave historical discourses, but we do want to realize that she is there, a fixed domestic institution, bringing Francis Joseph, in a sense, into line even with the Habsburgs, whose vagaries have caused him consternation. If she had predecessors, she has had no rivals. And no story arises out of the invitations to the Imperial alcove of which certain other theatrical ladies used to boast in the earlier years of the reign. We will leave those matters, therefore, and next give the necessary passing glance at the Emperor's notorious passion for field sports, a passion which has contributed more than a little towards his popularity. It often is so, such tastes being held to contribute the touch of nature which makes the whole world kin, and the belief that a good shot is sure to be a good fellow being deeply rooted in the human breast, especially if the sportsman respects the rights of property and compensates agriculturists for damage done in the pursuit of game. To some extent, indeed, the mere fact that an emperor does not go shooting in his crown and royal robes, but in a costume similar to that worn by the peasants themselves, conveys to the bucolic mind a pleasant impression of condescending affability. Moreover, rustics like to be employed as beaters, and enjoy hearing and handing on stories of imperial sportsmen wandering and losing themselves and being mistaken for other people and keeping up the illusion and laughing at the mistake. There has been a good deal of that sort of thing in Francis Joseph's reign, and his most popular portraits are those which exhibit him, alike as a young man, an old man, and a man of middle age, attired in knickerbockers, heavily nailed boots, and a picturesquely plumed Tyrolese hat. A certain rapport seems to be established by those portraits between a sportsman emperor and a nation of sportsmen. Habited in the costume indicated, Francis Joseph has sometimes in the mountains and even in his own parks played the part of Harun al-Rashid, and many anecdotes are told about his adventures in that character. Not all of them, of course, are true, and we will hope that the more malicious stories are false. The story, for instance, that Francis Joseph, taking part in a battue in the midst of the troubles of 1866, asked an aged peasant for a light for his pipe, and was told the aged peasant's candid opinion of emperors who amused themselves by pursuing game when their subjects were dying for them on the stricken field, is probably the invention of a political malcontent. A more agreeable story, and one at which the emperor himself may chuckle, is that of his encounter with the farmer who took him for an ordinary trespasser and threatened that, if he did not clear off his land at once, he would first shoot him in the posterior parts as a mark of identification and then inform the police. And he is, no doubt, as pleased as his people are to remember how he once arrested poachers with his own hand in one of his own parks. And having satisfied himself of the truth of their representation, that they were honest old soldiers who had come to poverty through no fault of their own, gave orders that they should be given appointments as gamekeepers. A ruler of whom stories of that last kind are told never fails to be popular with the sporting classes of the community, and the parade of gamekeepers from all parts of the empire, which was one of the most picturesque features of Francis Joseph's Jubilee celebrations, impresses one as a most proper sequel thereto. These stories, however, though necessary to atmosphere, are only incidental. It is enough to glance at them, just as it is enough to glance at the story of those worldwide wanderings of the Empress, which began long before she had provided Frau Schratt to entertain the Emperor during her absence, with her sudden departure for Madeira in 1860. Legend has crystallized round that departure. It has been called a flight and attributed to the cumulative effect of three distinct domestic disturbances. First of all, we are told, there was a disturbance caused by the terrible Archduchess Sophia, who would not allow the Empress to bring up the infant crown prince in her own way. A trouble which may have been bitter at the time, in spite of Countess Marie Larish's assurance that the matter presently became one of absolute indifference to her. In the second place, we are informed, There was a disturbance because Francis Joseph made too public a display of his affectionate regard for a certain Fräulein role of one of the Viennese theaters. And finally, if the reports may be trusted, the quarrel reached its climax because Francis Joseph suffered himself to be fascinated by a peasant girl whom he met when out shooting. Francis Joseph, on that occasion, according to the story which was current, stayed out all night after dismissing his retainers. And one of the retainers told his wife what had happened, and the lady repeated the story to other ladies of the court at one of Elizabeth's receptions. And Elizabeth overheard and acted on the impulse of the moment. She dismissed her ladies and called her maid, announcing her intention of setting out at once, secretly, for a long journey. The maid did her bidding, and she got as far as Trieste, where a functionary, sent in pursuit, overtook her and induced her to return, a course to which she consented only on the understanding that, after appearances had been saved, she should be allowed to set out again, with the emperor's express approval. Whether things really happened just like that, whether it is true that the flight was only hindered by the discretion of the captain of the yacht, who opportunely discovered that his engines were out of repair, whether it is also true that Francis Joseph threw himself at Elizabeth's feet, confessing his fault, imploring her pardon, and ascribing the blame to his mother. All these are points on which a conscientious investigator would hesitate to commit himself. The story, given in Monsieur Weindel's François-Joseph Intime, is more than 50 years old, and no authoritative correspondence or procès-verbal relating to it has been published. All that is positively established is that the doctor was called in and certified that Elizabeth was suffering from a pulmonary weakness which necessitated her removal to a warmer climate. So she set out for Madeira, and Francis Joseph accompanied her a part of the way. How she left Madeira in a hurry, in consequence of reports sent home concerning her manner of life there, has already been set forth on the authority of Countess Marie Lariche. That was the beginning of her Wanderjahre, and there was to be no end to them until her death. Elizabeth had learnt the importance of keeping up appearances, and she did not forget it. Francis Joseph did not need to learn it, for he has always stood out among the backsliding Habsburgs as a great actor-manager, so to say, keeping up the imperiled dignity of the house by playing a great part on a great stage in a manner worthy of the great traditions to which so many members of his family have proved unfaithful. Noblesse oblige has been his motto, though not theirs, though he may only have given it a limited, spectacular application, and if Elizabeth did not meet him halfway in the matter, at least she went a part of the way to meet him. The result is known. On great ceremonial occasions, Elizabeth consented to appear, as she put it, in harness, and performed imperial functions with splendid, though perhaps absent-minded dignity. She was as beautiful as the Empress Eugenie. She had a grander, a less skittish manner, and she quite understood that the frame in which her beauty and grandeur were set at Schönbrunn and the Hofburg threw a halo of glory about her head, quite different from that which adorned the rival beauty who was queen of the revels at the Tuileries, Fontainebleau, St. Cloud, and Compiègne. But she was, nevertheless, always glad when the functions were over and the harness could be taken off. She was like little Nell's grandfather, whose one desire was to be further away. She never lost that impulse, and, if it ever slackened, something was always sure to happen to renew it. It received a great impetus from the tragedy of Meyerling, perhaps, it is hardly doubtful, an earlier impetus from the incident which drew from her the bitter remark that a baby is the end of many love affairs. So she wandered as much as she could, though she returned to Vienna when she felt that she must, and a detailed relation of her wanderings would almost read like a chapter from a road book. She saw the Isles of Greece and the Norwegian fjords. She bathed on the coast of Norfolk and hunted in Ireland and in the Shires. She sojourned for a season at Steephill Castle near Ventnor in the Isle of Wight, the present dwelling of an American gentleman who sells medicines reputed to be beneficial to the liver, and a red brick house in which she passed another season is pointed out at Cromer. She also went to Amsterdam for massage and to Cap Martin to sit in the sun, and she visited her home in Bavaria and her sisters, homes in Paris, and stayed at Claridge's in London, and drank the waters at Kissingen. It was sometimes thought that she deliberately courted death by her daring feats of horsemanship. Her manner became that of a woman for whom life had nothing left, except what converse with nature could offer. She even spoke of nature as her sole mediator with God, and the scattered fragments of her table talk which those who knew her have preserved are full of detached sentiments of a kind of poetic pessimism. Quote, "We must try to make islands of ourselves. When we cannot be happy in the way that we desire, there is nothing for it but to fall in love with our sorrows. In the life of every man there comes a time when his inner life becomes extinct. I know that he who revolts suffers 100 times more than he who is resigned, but resignation is a thing of which I am not capable. I should like to be buried near the sea, so that the waves might beat against my coffin. Then all the stars in heaven would shine on me, and the cypresses would lament for me far longer than either men or women." Such phrases sound, as it were, the leitmotif of the mystery of Elizabeth's life. She seems to have thrown them out, without telling anyone what sorrow or disappointment had inspired them. Each reporter who tries to guess at their meaning offers a different conjecture. The unkindness of Francis Joseph, who was not unkind. The unkindness of some lover, who was. The tragic deaths of her son, her cousin, her brother-in-law, and her sister. All these things have been cited, by one chronicler or another, as explanations of her funereal gloom. But, as she confided in no one need pretend to know, or to do more than draw the picture of a woman as unhappy as she was beautiful, clinging to her unhappiness as she clung to her beauty, wandering restlessly through Europe like a shadow pursuing shadows, but running home from time to keep up appearances. And the picture, to be complete, should also show the figure of Francis Joseph, doing his full share in the keeping up of those appearances, and taking long journeys in order to pay periodical visits to the Empress, who was making it so clear to all who cared to look that she was happiest away from home, and always wearing on his countenance that look of bland and imperturbable serenity with which his innumerable portraits have made Europe familiar. It is a picture full of lights and shadows and strange contrasts, but we must not dwell upon it any more. Our attention is claimed by the supplementary spectacle of the emperor at odds with fate, confronting the difficulties which threatened to tear his empire to tatters, and gradually getting that empire into some sort of order.
Chapter 12.
Other things besides his wife's secret sorrows, or even his own, claimed Francis Joseph's attention through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The hour for the fulfillment of Countess Curly's curse had not yet sounded, but it did seem as if that breakup of Austria, which statesmen think about when they lie awake at night, was imminent. Hungary was sullen. Prussia was ambitious and jealous. The Italian subjects of the Habsburgs hated them. It was the Italians who were destined to speak first. They had already spoken in 1848, but then they had been silenced because Radetzky had been a good general and Charles Albert a bad one. But Victor Emmanuel was a greater man than Charles Albert, and he had Cavour to guide him. Italia farà da sé, Italy will work out her own destiny, had been Charles Albert's motto. Victor Emmanuel and Cavour played a more subtle game and looked out for allies, and in Napoleon III. They found an ally who was quite willing to help them, a sympathetic man who had once been involved in the Carbonari movement, a sensitive man whom the head of the House of Habsburg had snubbed as a parvenu by proposing to address him as Sir instead of brother. So Napoleon's sympathies were worked upon, and the wires were pulled. It is said that the beautiful Countess Castiglione helped to pull them, adding the influence of her charms to that of her arguments, and the statement is probable enough, for the Emperor of the French was susceptible. At any rate, he presently asked Cavour the point-blank question, "What can one do for Italy?" And a little later, in July 1858, he had a quiet talk with Cavour at the baths of Plombières and arranged what should be done and what should be his own share of the plunder. Francis Joseph may have guessed what was coming when he read the reports of Victor Emmanuel's speech at the opening of his parliament in January 1859, containing the pregnant declaration that, while respecting treaties, we cannot disregard the cry of grief which rises to us from so many parts of Italy. His guesses must have become certainties when, at the New Year's reception of the Corps Diplomatique, Napoleon remarked, with chilly politeness, to Hübner, now Austrian ambassador, in the hearing of all the other ambassadors, "I regret that our relations with your government are not so good as they have been, but I beg you to assure your emperor that my personal sentiments towards him have undergone no change." Unquote. A double-edged saying, for his feelings were hardly likely to be friendly towards the originator of the scheme for snubbing him as Sir instead of saluting him as brother. In any case, it was a saying which meant war, and war was not long delayed. Francis Joseph, in fact, anticipated the inevitable by summoning Sardinia to disarm within 3 days. But Sardinia refused to disarm, and the French came over the Alps, beat Francis Joseph at Magenta and Solferino, and turned him out of Lombardy, though allowing him to retain Venetia. That was the beginning of the end, and the event contains an important moral. The moral that the one permanent peril to European peace arises out of the hatred invariably felt for persons of German nationality by the races subjected to their rule. The trouble with the German, whether of the North or of the South, is always this, that he regards himself as a heaven-sent ruler of men, but can, as a matter of fact, only govern in a state of siege. He can win battles and organize a civil service, but he can neither conciliate nor assimilate his subjects. The German Empire is sometimes compared, by Germans, to the Roman Empire, but the difference between the two things is wide. The Romans, when they conquered the world, made it contentedly Roman. The French, similarly, when they took over Savoy from Italy, made it contentedly French. But no German dependency is ever contentedly German. Alsace is not, nor is Schleswig-Holstein or Prussian Poland. In all these places, the German, in his jackboots, strides about among a people who find his language barbarous, his culture ridiculous, and himself an odious interloper. And it has been the same thing in Austrian Italy, where, even to this day, the few Italians who remain unredeemed refuse so much as to join the Austrian Alpine Club, but have preferred to form a smaller Alpine club of their own. In the days of which we are speaking, Austria ruled Lombardy and Venetia as subject provinces. At the same time, other Habsburgs reigned in Modena and Tuscany, while the abominable Bomba of Naples was the Empress Elisabeth's brother-in-law. Not in his own provinces only, but throughout Italy, popular representation was roughly refused. Italy, it was held, was a geographical expression, and must behave as such. If it did not, then leading Italian citizens must be hanged. And if there were any difficulty in getting evidence to hang them on, it must be obtained by torture. It is a fact, incredible as it may seem, that the Austrians used in the 50s to torture their Italian subjects in prison. It is a fact that they flogged and sometimes executed Italian civilians for failing in outward respect towards the Austrian soldiery. It is a fact that they flogged women for the comments which they passed on such proceedings. It is a fact that they shot a butcher, found in possession of a butcher's knife for carrying forbidden arms, and a lunatic for going through the motions of drill in a public thoroughfare. It is a fact, finally, that, exasperated at the manner in which every official Austrian institution was boycotted, they notified the public that, if anybody by criminal political obstinacy persisted in not frequenting the theater, such conduct would be regarded as the silent demonstration of a criminal disposition, which merited to be sought out and punished. The policy was as childish as it was savage, and as savage as it was childish. Gladstone had it in mind when he made his famous remark that nowhere on the map of Europe could one lay one's finger and say, "Here Austria has done good." His mistake lay not in offering that criticism, but in afterwards apologizing for having offered it. What the Italians themselves thought of the matter is best shown by the written declaration which one of their victims handed in to his judges after his condemnation to death. "I declare," he said, "that, rather than deny the sacred principles on which the cause of Italian liberty and independence repose, rather than adhere to the rapacious policy of Austria, rather than sanction its claims by any act which might seem to concede them, or by any submission to its authority, I, Pietro Fortunato Calvi, once officer of the Austrian army and late colonel of the Italian army during the War of Independence, now condemned to death for the crime of high treason, go joyfully to this death, declaring from the scaffold that what I have done knowingly, and that I would be ready to do it again in order to drive the Austrians out of the states which they have infamously usurped." Unquote. His judges asked him, in their arrogance, whether he would ask the pardon of the Austrians for his disloyalty to them. His reply was that he desired neither their pardon nor any other favor. "I hate, and will always hate, the Austrians until the end of my life for all the ill they have done to Italy." Unquote. The Austrians, that is to say, behaved as shamefully in Italy as in Hungary. And this time Francis Joseph was held responsible. When he took his bride to pay his Italian dominions a ceremonial visit, the Italians made it clear to him, as they subsequently made it clear to the Archduke Maximilian and the Archduchess Charlotte, that what was desired was not his condescension or that of any member of his family, but both his and their ejection. They made it clear in various ingeniously offensive ways. When the Archduke Maximilian appeared with the Archduchess in the piazza at Venice, the whole population withdrew, leaving them alone there, as if they were lepers who might spread contamination. When Francis Joseph, accompanied by the Empress Elisabeth, drove through the streets of Milan, not a head was uncovered, and not a cheer was heard, all the acclamations being pointedly reserved for the Italian syndic, who was compelled as an official to follow in the procession. The Italian ladies, at the same time, dressed so as to display, by a cunning arrangement of stuffs, the colors of the Italian flag. And, when the Guerra, Guerra chorus from Norma was sung in the Scala, the audience applauded it as if they would never stop. It seemed, therefore, to be Victor Emmanuel's clear mission to help the Italians to fulfill an obvious destiny. And Victor Emmanuel's mission was Napoleon's opportunity to show Francis Joseph, as he had already shown the Tsar, that emperors who treated him as a parvenu did so at their peril. So he and Victor Emmanuel fought shoulder to shoulder and made a typical little bit of Austrian history. Typical because, as we shall see when we proceed, Italia Irredenta is only one of many districts whose inhabitants regard themselves as unredeemed and desire to work out their salvation with the help of their nationals over the border. There is also, as we shall note presently, a Servia Irredenta and a Romania Irredenta, of which we are likely to hear a good deal in the immediate future, though this is not the place for speaking of them. Here we will merely note that Francis Joseph himself took part in the Italian campaign, heading a charge with the cry, "Forward, my lads, I too am a married man with a family." An exclamation not without its irony for those, if there were any, among his hearers who knew the particulars of his married life. Though a brave soldier, however, he was by no means a soldier of genius. Apparently, indeed, it is only as a linguist and a figurehead, the sublime figurehead of the Habsburgs who need a figurehead so badly, that he possesses genius. In other respects, he seems to have been, as Herr Wolfling was, at a later date, to the Princess Louisa of Tuscany, a very ordinary man. In any case, he proved himself a very ordinary general, whom very ordinary generals were able to defeat. Partly, perhaps, because his Hungarian soldiers showed great alacrity in deserting him, but he sulked, with characteristic Habsburg sullenness, over the terms of peace. In particular, he sulked over the following article: "The Emperor of Austria cedes his rights over Lombardy to the Emperor of the French, who, in accordance with the wishes of the population, will hand them over to the King of Sardinia." What, he asked Prince Napoleon, who was charged with the negotiations, was the meaning of that odd expression, "the wishes of the population"? Prince Napoleon replied that it meant just what it seemed to mean, that there was not an Italian in Lombardy who was not eager to see the Austrians turned out of that province. Whereupon Francis Joseph smote the table and raised his voice. "For my own part," he said, "I recognize no rights except those which are incorporated in treaties. According to the treaties, Lombardy belongs to me. My arms having been unfortunate, I am quite willing to cede the territory to the Emperor Napoleon. But I cannot recognize the wishes of the population, for that is only another phrase for the right of revolution." Use the phrase if you must in your treaty with the King of Sardinia and in your proclamations to the Italian people. That is no business of mine. But you must clearly understand that I, the Emperor of Austria, emphatically refuse to put my signature to such a form of words." Unquote. It did not matter, so Napoleon did not insist. The head of the Habsburgs was quite welcome to make the gestures of pride while munching the pie of humility, a way of keeping up their dignity in depressing circumstances in which the Habsburgs are the worthy rivals of the Bourbons, and Francis Joseph, in particular, is the worthy rival of Louis XVIII, who treated the Allied sovereigns as his lackeys when they restored him to his throne. A more important matter was that, though Francis Joseph had been given his lesson, he had not learnt it, and that Napoleon, owing to dangers near home, had not been able to make the lesson as complete as he would have liked. Napoleon had promised that Italy should be free from the Alps to the Adriatic, but he heard that Prussia was mobilizing on the Rhine and left his work unfinished. Not only was Venetia left to Austria, but Habsburg dukes of Tuscany and Modena were also restored to the states from which their subjects had expelled them, though the latter had actually shot his political prisoners after first flogging them before taking to flight. Whence, of course, two consequences followed. In the first place, Francis Joseph was confirmed in his stubborn view that he did really possess the right of ruling over Italians who loathed him. In the second place, the Italians continued to loathe him, and it was as certain as anything could be that, when his struggle with Prussia for the German hegemony came to a head, he would have to face a second day of reckoning with Victor Emmanuel.
This concludes today's reading of the life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.